It's been about a week since the final episode of DuckTales 2017 came out. I've had some time to think about the final episode, having the opportunity to rewatch it a few times. I did a video on my immediate reaction to it that I have posted earlier in the week, and I was a little bit emotionally disturbed. I usually don't get emotional over TV shows or books or whatever, but this one I was quite emotional. I've had a time to rewatch and to be coherent, and I want to talk now in a more cool, analytical voice about the final episode of DuckTales 2017, and also talk a bit about the Darkwing Duck reboot. But first, I have a shiny new introduction, and I'm gonna show that off in 3, 2, 1. Hi, I'm Tommy, and I'm a professional paleontologist. By day, I use the latest data science techniques to reconstruct ecological and evolutionary changes from the fossil record. But by night, I investigate cryptids, the paranormal, mediumship, the occult, politics, history, philosophy, and even God himself. All the things that good little scientists are supposed to avoid. If you want to join me on my journey, friend, be so kind as to like and subscribe. And welcome to Creepy Puppets Presents. Okay, so full spoilers are in effect for this discussion. So the first thing I want to talk about are two observations that I had that a lot of other people who've watched this finale and discussed the finale haven't talked about, but I really want to, because the kind of things that bothered me. The first is the implication that Bradford murdered Duckworth. I've only heard one other person mention it, and it is mentioned on the TV Tropes page. But yeah, it's heavily implied in the scene where Bradford talks about how he's trying to contain Scrooge's life, that he isolated Scrooge McDuck, and it shows a picture of Duckworth and Scrooge being sad about his death. The implication there being it was Bradford who murdered Duckworth. That was quite disturbing to think about. But the other observation I had that no one seems to have made is the box in which the papyrus was found. When I first saw the episode, it was driving me crazy that I had seen that box somewhere before. But I have finally remembered where I saw that box from, and it's a very similar design. If you've seen the 1990 DuckTales movie, in the beginning, they find a box that belonged to Kali Baba, and instead of having Kali Baba's lost treasure, it has a bunch of robes, one of which has a map to the treasure in the pocket. The box in which the papyrus was found is very similar to the design of that box. I think getting to the central question of the review, that sort of the question on everyone's mind is, if this is the last we get of these iterations of these characters, as sad as the thought might be that this is the end of these versions of these characters, would it be a satisfactory parting? And I'm going to say, for the most part, yes. I think Della could have been given a little bit more room. I think Huey could have been given a little more room. But ultimately, I think this was a serviceable and satisfactory ending for all of these characters. A question that several people have brought up is, how does the life of Webby change now that she is blood related to the other characters? Aside from, making all the Dewey ships a lot more awkward. A lot of people have said that they don't think her life will change meaningfully at all, and I largely agree with that. I do think, though, probably she's going to need to have some conversations with each of the people. Certainly with the triplets, that they seem to have already embraced the familial connection. But she could probably benefit with personal conversations with Donald, and especially with Della, because of the similarity between the two, and now that we know that they're first cousins, and Della was Scrooge's practice daughter, I imagine that they have a lot more in common, but I think they will probably have had to have a conversation about that to sort out all of their feelings. That said, if they do want to continue the series, there's no reason they couldn't at a later point. They didn't set up a new villain or a cliffhanger, but there's no reason they couldn't. The only major DuckTales villain we didn't get in the reboot was Murloc, and, they could certainly add him in, or they could make him a villain over on the Darkwing Duck reboot, which would be neat. But before we talk about that, I want to talk briefly about Huey, and something a lot of people have mentioned also is sort of the role that Huey plays in autistic representation. So I think Danny Pudi is getting typecast as a revolutionary portrayal of autism, but we're not allowed to know that, given this role and Abed. But especially in this season, the heavy implication that Huey is autistic. We have this dialogue about him being wired differently and compared to a robot, and how he likes to go on and on about facts, and his brothers wish that he would shut up, and his love of order and his desire to be in control and not allow the, quote, Duke of making a mess to get out, his Donald-like rage. That is a thing that a lot of autistic people deal with, is the idea of trying to suppress autistic traits in order to be perceived as normal. I think that the season did give us a couple of episodes where this was addressed, but it would have been nice to call him autistic to sort of confirm the representation. But other than that, I think this ending was quite good. Now, this is probably going to be a controversial point, but I want to talk about the Darkwing Duck reboot. So I know a lot of people are hoping that the Darkwing Duck reboot will be a reboot with these versions of the characters. So this version of Launchpad, this version of Drake, and this version of Gosalyn. And I know we're all hoping that because fans of the show want more of these characters. But I think that is probably a bad decision. I think we're much better off rebooting it clean with completely new versions. I hate to say it, but we're much better off with new versions of Drake, Launchpad, and Gosalyn. And here's why I said that. So I recently watched Darkly Dawns the Duck again, which is the pilot episode of the original Darkwing Duck, and Let's Get Dangerous, the DuckTales episode of Season 3, that is the, let's face it, backdoor pilot, and it's a remake of Darkly Dawns the Duck. And the original is just so much better. And the reason it's so much better is that the characters are so much more memorable. The Disney Afternoon didn't really go into a lot of character development. Probably Aladdin was the one that had the most character development, in that the driving character thread in that show was the tension between Aladdin's former life and the life he was currently trying to enter. But usually Disney Afternoon shows were very well developed characters that had a very distinct personality, and they stayed that way, and the comedy came from the conflict. So if you go back and you watch the original Darkwing Duck, these are very strong characters conflicting with each other. And I hate to say it, but this version of Darkwing Duck is too nice and too boring. And this version of Launchpad is too stupid, where the original version of the character was much more of kind of a working class, uneducated person, and I'm not an idiot. And then this version of Gosalyn is just too bland. Most of the comedy in the original show and most of the heart is the relationship between Gosalyn and Darkwing, the love they had for each other and the conflict they have for each other. And this version of Gosalyn and this version of Darkwing are just boring to watch, which would effectively make it just the Launchpad show. And again, this version is too stupid to be that interesting to watch also. I know that a lot of us are hoping that we'll see more of these versions of these characters again on the Darkwing Duck reboot, but we're probably better off. We would probably have a better show if we didn't. So these have been my thoughts on the DuckTales series as it came to an end, and the forthcoming Darkwing Duck reboot, and I probably won't touch these stories again, although if we do get a Darkwing Duck reboot, I may review that. But for right now, these are my concluding thoughts on it. All right, well, thank you for sticking in for me to ramble about a kid's show, and I will see everybody a little bit later. Bye-bye.